300 guests filled the ballroom of the Beaufort Yacht Club on a Saturday evening in July, and Margot Hargrove owned the silence between every clink of crystal. She stepped to the microphone, smiled the kind of smile that expected applause before it earned any, and announced that she would be donating her late father's yacht to someone truly deserving. She paused, then she called the name Garrett Calloway, the boat mechanic from the South Marina, and the room broke into laughter. Garrett stood, looked directly at Margot, and nodded once. His 8-year-old son Nolan reached up and held his father's hand. No one in that room knew the yacht was worth $11 million. Garrett Calloway's mornings all looked the same. He woke at 4:45, stood in the kitchen of the small clapboard house on Ann Street while the coffee brewed, and packed a lunch for Nolan: turkey sandwich, apple slices, a thermos of lemonade, and the sandwich always placed on top so the boy could find it without looking. By 6:30 they walked 3 blocks to the bus stop on Front Street, where Garrett waited until the bus pulled away before heading to the marina. The one-man repair shop he ran occupied a rented slip at the south end of the Beaufort Harbor. It was nothing more than a corrugated tin roof bolted to a dock piling, a rolling tool cart, and a workbench scarred by a decade of use that wasn't his. He fixed outboard motors for charter captains, patched fiberglass for weekend sailors, and replaced bilge pumps for anyone who asked. The work was steady, the pay was enough, the quiet was the point. 3 years earlier, his wife Leah had died from pancreatic cancer at Centara Norfolk General Hospital in Virginia, where Garrett had spent 11 years building a career in naval architecture. He had designed hull systems for Montague Marine Group, one of the most respected custom yacht builders on the East Coast, and his signature appeared on the structural drawings of vessels worth more than most people's neighborhoods. After Leah's funeral, he sold the house in Norfolk, withdrew Nolan from kindergarten, and drove south until the road met the water in a town small enough that no one would know his name. Beaufort gave him that. It gave him salt air and dock work and the anonymity of a man who fixes things instead of designing them. But Beaufort also gave him Margot Hargrove. She had inherited her father Richard's coastal real estate empire 18 months ago and intended to expand it. The old marina district with its weathered docks, long-term tenants, and small-time commercial fishermen sat on waterfront acreage she wanted to convert into a boutique resort and spa. Most slipholders had already sold their leases back to her. Garrett had not. His refusal wasn't loud. He simply said no each time her people came around, signed nothing, and went back to work. That was enough to make him a problem in Margot's ledger. Sloane Perry arrived in Beaufort on a Tuesday, carrying a litigation bag and a court appointment to administer the remaining assets of the Hargrove estate. She was 37, a maritime estate attorney from a mid-size firm in Wilmington, and she had reviewed enough inheritance disputes to know that the clean ones never required a site visit. This one required a site visit. She found Garrett at the marina that afternoon, standing on the dock beside the listing yacht. She introduced herself, explained her role, and asked for access to inspect the vessel as part of the asset inventory. Garrett agreed without hesitation, but as he walked her along the starboard side, pointing out the hull breach near the waterline and the seized rudder shaft below, Sloane noticed something. He described the yacht's mechanical systems with a precision that didn't belong to a man who fixed outboard motors for a living. He referenced the displacement tonnage without checking a single document. He identified the engine configuration by sound alone. She didn't say anything. She wrote it down. After Sloane left, Garrett stood alone on the dock as the sun dropped behind the tree line on Carrot Island. The yacht tilted at a 6-degree list in the tidal current, barnacles crawling up the port side, the teak deck warped from 3 seasons of neglect. He placed his hand flat against the hull, just above the waterline, and held it there. It wasn't the gesture of a man inspecting something given to him as junk. It was the gesture of a man recognizing something he had built with his own hands. The next morning, Garrett began working on the yacht before sunrise. He didn't start with the hull breach, which would have been the logical first step for any repair mechanic. Instead, he went below deck and opened the engine compartment hatch, moving through the cramped space as though he were reading a blueprint he had memorized years ago. He traced the fuel lines with 2 fingers, followed the electrical conduit along the overhead beams, and stopped at the portside structural frame where a previous surveyor had noted stress fracturing. He ran his thumb along the joint and shook his head, not because the damage was worse than expected, but because the repair someone else had attempted was wrong. He knew it was wrong the way a composer knows a wrong note. He had drawn that joint. He had specified the weld angle. Sloane returned to the marina 4 days later to collect Garrett's signature on the transfer of title documents. She found him inside the engine compartment, crouched beneath a fluorescent work light he had rigged from the overhead beam. The walls of the compartment were bare except for one thing: a laminated technical drawing pinned to the bulkhead with marine-grade adhesive. It was a cross-sectional schematic of the yacht's hull, annotated in blue ink with structural load calculations, material specifications, and design tolerances. In the bottom right corner, in a drafter's precise hand, was a signature block: G. Callaway, Callaway Naval Design, Norfolk. Sloane stared at it for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed. Water slapped against the hull below them. Garrett had designed this yacht 12 years ago for Montague Marine Group, commissioned by Richard Hargrove himself. He had known exactly what it was worth, what it contained, what it meant from the moment Margot called his name on that stage. "Why didn't you say anything?" Sloane asked. Garrett climbed out of the compartment, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and looked at her without defensiveness or apology. "She wanted me to be embarrassed," he said. "I wasn't." Sloane didn't respond. She set the documents on the workbench and waited while he signed. The pen looked small in his hand. When Nolan came running down the dock after school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, the boy climbed aboard the yacht without hesitation, the way children board things that already belonged to them. He sat cross-legged on the foredeck and looked up at Sloane with the open, unguarded expression of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "Dad says this boat is like an old friend," Nolan said. "He knew it before I was even born." Sloane looked at the boy, then at Garrett, who had gone back to work beneath the deck without acknowledging the conversation. She gathered her documents and walked back to her car, but the way she looked at Garrett Callaway had changed. He was no longer a line item on an asset inventory. That evening, in her temporary office at the Beaufort Courthouse Annex, Sloane reopened the Hargrove estate file. For the first time, she typed Callaway into the document search bar and ran it across every page of the probate record. One result appeared on the final page of the original will draft, but the text surrounding the name had been redacted with a thick black marker. Someone had taken the time to obscure it deliberately. Sloane pulled a fresh legal pad from her drawer and set it beside the file. She didn't write anything yet, but she left the page open. Over the next week, Sloane worked through the Hargrove estate file with the kind of attention she usually reserved for cases worth twice the billing rate. What she found was a fracture. The probate record contained 2 versions of Richard Hargrove's will. The notarized version, the one currently governing the estate, left the entirety of Richard's assets to his daughter Margot, including all real estate holdings, financial accounts, and the yacht. But buried in the appendix of the original court filing was an earlier draft, unsigned but printed on Richard's personal letterhead, that told a different story. In that version, the yacht and its contents were bequeathed not to Margot, but to an entity called the Hargrove Maritime Heritage Foundation, a charitable trust that, as far as Sloane could determine, had never been formally established. The legal implication was immediate and sharp. If the earlier draft represented Richard's true intent and the notarized version had been altered after execution, then Margot had no legal authority to donate the yacht to anyone. The gift to Garrett was void, but so was Margot's claim to ownership, and depending on the evidence, the alteration of a testamentary instrument constituted criminal fraud. Sloane found Eugene Voss at the end of the commercial pier on a Thursday afternoon. He was 64 years old, sun-darkened and deliberate in his movements, sitting on a wooden bench outside the small bait-and-tackle shop he managed near the harbor mouth. He had served as Richard Hargrove's personal captain for 20 years, the longest tenure of anyone in Richard's employ. When Sloane asked about the yacht, Eugene chose his words the way a man chooses steps on wet rock. "Richard loved that boat more than anything he ever owned," he said. "More than the houses, more than the land. He never would have wanted it sold." Sloane waited for more. Eugene looked out at the water and offered nothing. She returned to the marina that afternoon with supplemental filings for Garrett. He was aboard the yacht, sanding teak panels in the main cabin with long, even strokes that followed the grain. A portable radio on the workbench played something low and indistinct. He saw the documents in her hand and nodded toward the nav station, where a French press sat next to a bag of grocery store coffee. "Help yourself," he said. Sloane poured a cup and sat on the bench seat across from him. For the first time, their conversation drifted past the edges of paperwork. She asked about Nolan, how he liked the school in Beaufort, whether he had friends down at the docks. Garrett answered in short, complete sentences that gave just enough and no more. Then he asked why she had chosen maritime law. Sloane paused before answering. She told him her grandfather had been a tugboat captain in Charleston Harbor and that she had spent every summer of her childhood riding the wheelhouse while the old man guided barges through the Cooper River. It was the most personal thing either of them had said to the other. Neither of them acknowledged the shift, but the silences between their sentences lasted longer than they should have, and neither of them moved to fill them. That night, Margot Hargrove sat in the study of her father's house on the bluff overlooking Taylor Creek. Her phone was pressed to her ear. On the other end was her private attorney in Raleigh. "The estate lawyer is asking questions about the will," Margot said. Her voice was flat, controlled, and entirely without warmth. "Handle her before she handles me." The pressure came fast and from above. Margot's private attorney contacted the senior partners at Sloane's firm in Wilmington, citing a formal conflict of interest. The allegation was specific. Sloane Perry had developed a personal relationship with Garrett Calloway, a party to the estate, and her continued involvement in the administration compromised the objectivity of the proceedings. The partners scheduled an internal review call with Sloane for the following morning. Sloane sat in the conference room of her hotel, laptop open, and answered every question with the precision of someone who had spent her career preparing for cross-examination. She stated that her interactions with Garrett Calloway had been limited to the scope of her duties as a state counsel. She stated that no personal relationship existed. She stated that the conflict of interest claim was manufactured by a party with a direct financial interest in obstructing the review of the estate. Everything she said was defensible, and half of it was no longer entirely true. She had begun noticing things about Garrett that had nothing to do with probate. The way he never raised his voice, even when marina tenants argued with him about dock fees, the careful way he packed Nolan's lunch every morning, always the same order, always the sandwich on top. The fact that he worked on the yacht every evening after Nolan went to sleep, moving through the hull with a tenderness that suggested he owed the vessel something more than labor. At the marina, Margot sent a team of her own appraisers to conduct an independent valuation of the yacht. Their purpose was transparent produce a report concluding the vessel had no meaningful value, which would undercut any legal challenge by rendering the bequest irrelevant. The appraisers walked the exterior, photographed the listing hull, cataloged the visible corrosion, and delivered their findings within 48 hours. The yacht was worth less than its scrap weight in aluminum and fiberglass. They never inspected the lower compartments. Garrett had locked them, citing structural instability in the deck framing. No one questioned a boat mechanic's judgment about safety. Meanwhile, Garrett worked faster. The hull breach was patched. The rudder shaft was freed. The bilge pumps were replaced and tested. Each repair was executed with a speed and confidence that didn't match the profile of a marina handyman troubleshooting a junked boat. He was restoring the yacht the way its architect would because he was its architect. One afternoon, Nolan found Sloane pulling file boxes from the trunk of her car in the marina parking lot. He walked over without being asked and picked up the smallest box, holding it with both hands against his chest. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" he said. "Dad's a really good cook." Sloane smiled and told him she had work to finish, but as she drove out of the lot, she looked in the rearview mirror at the boy walking toward the dock with the box balanced in his arms, and at his father standing on the foredeck of the yacht, watching her car leave without moving. That night, Eugene Voss stood alone on the commercial pier. The marina lights reflected off the harbor water in long, broken lines. He took out his phone, scrolled through his contacts slowly, and stopped when the name Sloane Perry appeared. His thumb hovered over the call button. He held it there for 6 full seconds, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the yacht across the basin. Then he lowered the phone and slid it back into his jacket pocket. Garrett finished the hull restoration on a Saturday morning and moved into the interior cabin work. He had been approaching this moment deliberately for days, because he knew what was behind the aft bulkhead of the main stateroom. He had designed it himself 12 years ago. A concealed compartment built into the structural framing of the transom, accessible only by removing a specific panel of teak cladding that appeared identical to every other panel on the wall. Richard Hargrove had requested it personally during the design phase. "I want something no one will find unless they truly understand the boat," he had said. At the time, Garrett assumed it was for valuables. He hadn't asked further. Now he pried the panel loose with a flathead screwdriver and reached into the dark cavity behind it. Inside was a brass document tube, heavy and cool to the touch, sealed at both ends with burgundy wax. He opened it carefully, cracking the seals with a pocket knife. The tube contained a rolled sheaf of original design drawings, the same hull schematics Garrett had drafted over a decade earlier, annotated in a hand he recognized from 100 commissioning meetings, Richard Hargrove's handwriting. Across the top margin in blue fountain pen, Richard had written 7 words. "For the foundation, not for sale, not for her." Garrett sat on the cabin floor for a long time, holding the drawings against his knees. He understood now what Richard Hargrove had done. The old man knew his daughter would liquidate everything, the houses, the land, the boats, the legacy, so he hid the proof of his true intentions inside the one thing he believed would endure. The yacht he loved more than any other possession, concealed in a compartment that only the man who designed the boat could find. That evening, Garrett called Sloane. It was the first time he had contacted her outside of a scheduled appointment. His voice on the phone was the same voice he used for everything, level, unhurried, giving away nothing, but the fact that he called at all said more than his words did. She arrived at the marina after dark. The dock lights cast long amber reflections across the water, and the yacht sat upright in its slip for the first time in months, the restored hull pale and clean under the overhead lamp. They sat on the foredeck. Garrett unrolled the drawings between them and pointed to Richard's handwriting. Sloane read the inscription twice without speaking. For 30 seconds, neither of them said a word. The only sound was the water moving against the pilings and the distant clatter of halyards from the sailboats in the next basin. Garrett set the drawings down flat. Sloane reached forward to press the curling edge of the paper against the deck. Their fingers stopped less than an inch apart. "I'll need to authenticate the handwriting," Sloane said quietly. "If it matches his known exemplars, this is direct evidence that the notarized will was altered." Garrett nodded. Neither of them said anything else. The tide shifted beneath the hull and the dock lines creaked in the cleats. By morning, Margot had the information she needed. Her source at the marina, a dock attendant who owed the Hargrove family 2 years of deferred rent, reported that Garrett had recovered something from inside the yacht. He didn't know what. Margot didn't wait to find out. She scheduled an emergency session with the Beaufort Town Council for the following week, requesting an expedited safety review of the Marina District. Her stated concern was structural. The yacht posed a public hazard and should be impounded immediately. Her actual target was Garrett Calloway, his dock slip, and whatever he had pulled out of that boat. The council chamber was full on a Wednesday afternoon, the overhead fans turning slowly above rows of folding chairs. Margot sat in the front row with her attorney, a binder of inspection reports on her lap, and the practiced composure of a woman who had never lost a vote in this room. She presented her case with efficiency. The yacht was structurally compromised. The marina slip was not zoned for long-term vessel rehabilitation, and the continued presence of the vessel constituted a liability to the town and its waterfront businesses. She referenced 3 municipal codes and a state maritime safety statute. The council members listened the way employees listen to the person who signs their budget. Sloane attended the meeting in her capacity as a state counsel. She challenged the inspection reports on procedural grounds. The appraisers had not conducted a full interior survey. The structural claims were based on external observation only, and the safety codes Margot cited did not apply to vessels undergoing documented restoration. Her arguments were technically sound, but the council leaned toward Margot the way water follows gravity, not because of logic, but because of weight. Margot's charitable foundation had funded the town's new fire station, the library renovation, and the waterfront park where the council members' own children played. Objectivity had a price, and Margot had paid it years in advance. Then the chamber door opened. Eugene Voss walked in. No one had invited him, and no one expected him. He moved to the front of the room without waiting for recognition, set a sealed envelope on the clerk's table, and stepped back. The room went still. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Richard Hargrove, addressed to Eugene, dated 4 months before Richard's death. The letter confirmed 3 things. First, the yacht contained a collection of 18th-century maritime charts and navigational instruments stored in the concealed compartment, valued at an estimated $4 million. Second, Richard's true and final will bequeath the yacht and its entire contents to the Hargrove Maritime Heritage Foundation, not to his daughter. Third, and this was the line that changed the temperature in the room, Richard stated that he expected Margot to alter the will after his death and asked Eugene to protect the truth. In his words, "When the right time comes." Eugene looked at the room. His voice was steady and plain. "I waited for the right person to find what that boat really is," he said. "That person is not Miss Hargrove." The chamber went silent. Margot did not move. Her attorney leaned toward her ear, but she showed no sign of hearing him. She stared straight ahead, her hands still on the binder, her face locked in an expression that could have been fury or disbelief, or the slow recognition that the floor beneath her had been hollow all along. Garrett, sitting in the 3rd row, said nothing, but he looked at Eugene across the room and gave a single nod, a gesture so quiet that only someone watching for it would have noticed. 2 men who understood each other without needing words to prove it. Sloane addressed the council. She requested a postponement of the safety review pending judicial examination of the new evidence. The council voted 5-2 in favor of the postponement. The meeting was adjourned. Afterward, Garrett and Sloane walked down the courthouse steps together toward the waterfront. The late afternoon sun hung low over the salt marshes to the west, and the air carried the smell of cordgrass and tidal mud. Garrett spoke more than he had spoken at any point since the night of the gala. "I designed that boat when I was 28, he said. "Leah told me to name it Second Wind. She said it sounded like a boat that was getting a fresh start. Richard Hargrove kept the name." Sloane didn't answer. She walked beside him for another 200 meters, past the marina gate, past the charter docks, until the path ended at the seawall. Then she stopped, and he stopped, and for a moment, the only thing between them was the sound of the wind moving through the rigging of the boats behind them. Sloane filed a petition with the Carteret County Superior Court the following Monday, requesting forensic authentication of the handwriting on the design drawings recovered from the yacht and the letter Eugene had presented to the town council. She also moved to freeze all Hargrove estate assets associated with the vessel pending a judicial determination of the will's validity. The forensic results came back in 9 days. The graphologist confirmed with a high degree of certainty that the handwriting on both documents, the inscription on the design drawings and the letter to Eugene, matched Richard Hargrove's known exemplars. More critically, the notarized will currently governing the estate showed evidence of post-execution amendment inconsistent with standard testamentary practice. In plain terms, someone had changed Richard Hargrove's will after he signed it. The formal appraisal of the yacht followed within the same week. The vessel itself, a Montague 68, custom-built, one of only 3 ever produced, was valued at $7 million, based on the rarity of the design and comparable sales of similar bespoke craft. The collection of 18th-century maritime charts and navigational instruments recovered from the concealed compartment was independently appraised at $4 million. Total assessed value, $11 million. Margot retained a litigation team from Charlotte to fight the challenge. Their strategy was aggressive and immediate. They attacked Eugene's credibility, arguing he was financially dependent on the Hargrove estate and therefore a biased witness. They disputed the evidentiary value of the letter, calling it unnotarized and inadmissible as testamentary proof. And they accused Garrett of having a direct financial motive to support the challenge, since the yacht had been gifted to him, and any increase in its assessed value benefited him. But the argument contained its own contradiction, and Sloane had already identified it. If the original will was restored, the yacht would be transferred to the Hargrove Maritime Heritage Foundation, not to Garrett. By supporting the challenge, Garrett was guaranteeing that he would lose the boat he had spent weeks restoring with his own hands. He had no financial stake in the outcome. He had the opposite. She sat across from him at the nav station aboard the yacht on an overcast Thursday and laid out the reality in plain terms. "If we succeed," she said, The yacht goes to the foundation. Not to you. You'll lose everything you've put into this. Garrett looked around the cabin at the teak panels he had sanded smooth, the engine compartment he had rewired, the deck planking he had resealed against the salt air. I didn't take this boat because it was worth $11 million, he said. I took it because I knew what it was. That Saturday, Nolan walked down the commercial pier to Eugene's bait shop and sat on the wooden bench beside the old man. Eugene dug 2 lengths of dock line from a bucket and began teaching the boy how to tie a bowline and a cleat hitch, guiding his small hands through each loop with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years working with rope and had never had a child of his own to show. When Nolan finished the bowline unassisted, his face lit up and he held the knot out for inspection. Eugene looked at it, then looked at the boy, and said, "Your granddad, your dad would be proud of you." The slip was small and immediate, and Eugene corrected it at once, but Nolan just smiled, as though the mistake had given him something he didn't know he was missing. Late that night, Sloane sat alone in her office at the courthouse annex, reviewing deposition transcripts under the light of a single desk lamp. Her phone lit up on the table beside her, an anonymous text. The screen showed a photograph taken from somewhere on the marina dock, at a distance, with the kind of zoom that suggested deliberate surveillance of Sloane and Garrett sitting on the foredeck of the yacht. The design drawings spread between them, the dock light casting both of them in amber. Below the image, 2 words: conflict of interest. Margot sent the photograph to 2 addresses simultaneously: the managing partners at Sloane's firm in Wilmington and the North Carolina State Bar's Office of Counsel. The complaint alleged that Sloane Perry had entered into a romantic relationship with Garrett Calloway, a direct party to the estate she was appointed to administer, in violation of Rule 8.4 of the North Carolina Rules of Professional Conduct regarding conflicts of interest and personal conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The firm received the complaint on a Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Sloane had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. She was removed from the Hargrove estate case. The evidence she had gathered, the authenticated design drawings, the forensic handwriting analysis, the letter from Eugene, the dual version will discrepancy remained admissible in court, but she could no longer be the attorney of record presenting it. Her law license was not suspended, but the open complaint would shadow her record until the bar completed its review. For a lawyer who had built her entire career on procedural discipline and professional credibility, the allegations struck at the foundation. Garrett found out from Eugene, who had heard it from the dock attendant, who had heard it from a clerk at the courthouse. He did not call Sloane. He drove to the coffee shop on Ann Street, not the marina, not the courthouse annex, nowhere that could be framed as professional contact, and found her at a corner table with a cold cup of coffee and a legal pad she hadn't written on. The pen lay across the blank page like something that had given up. He sat down across from her without asking permission. He didn't apologize. He didn't tell her everything would work out. He said, "I'm going to testify, not because of the boat, because Richard Hargrove deserved to have his wishes respected." Sloane looked at him. For the first time since they had met, her eyes weren't calculating, not weighing exposure, not measuring precedent, not mapping the next procedural step. They were just tired and open and fixed on someone she had come to trust without deciding to. "Did you know from the beginning it would get this complicated?" she asked. "I knew the night they called my name on that stage," Garrett said. The silence between them lasted a long time. The coffee sat untouched. The afternoon light moved across the table and neither of them followed it. But when Sloane stood to leave, Garrett stood at the same moment, not out of politeness, not because it was customary, but out of reflex, the way 2 people move in unison when they have begun to share the same gravitational center without naming it. Outside, the street was quiet. They walked to her car without speaking. Sloane unlocked the door, paused, and looked back at him once. Garrett held her gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked toward the marina. Neither of them said goodbye. Neither of them needed to. The court accepted the petition to hear the will challenge. Trial was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Margot's legal team filed 4 successive motions to delay. All 4 were denied. The courtroom at the Carteret County Courthouse was small and wood-paneled, built in a decade when justice was expected to be local and personal. Sloane sat in the gallery, 3 rows behind the plaintiff's table. She was not representing anyone. She was not on the record, but every piece of evidence being presented had been gathered under her direction, and the attorney who had replaced her followed her case file like a map drawn by someone who had already walked the ground. Garrett took the witness stand in the late morning. He wore a collared shirt and spoke in the same quiet, measured voice he used on the dock. He explained that he had spent 11 years as a naval architect at Callaway Naval Design in Norfolk, Virginia, specializing in custom yacht construction for Montague Marine Group. He confirmed that the yacht in question was a Montague 68, one of 3 ever built, commissioned by Richard Hargrove in the spring of 2013. He testified that he had personally designed the concealed compartment in the aft bulkhead of the main stateroom at Richard Hargrove's specific request. "Mr. Hargrove told me," Garrett said, looking not at the attorney but at the judge, "to design a space that no one would find unless they understood the boat." The implications settled over the courtroom. Richard Hargrove had hidden his true wishes inside a compartment that only the yacht's original designer could locate. He had chosen his secret keeper, not by trust, not by name, but by knowledge, the one thing that couldn't be bought, sold, or altered after the fact. Eugene testified after the lunch recess. He confirmed that Richard had grown distrustful of Margot during the final 2 years of his life, after discovering she had sold 3 family-owned properties without his knowledge or consent. Richard had consulted with his own attorney about revising the will, but his health declined before the new version could be executed and notarized. The letter to Eugene was his contingency, a dead man's instruction to the one person he believed would honor it. Margot's attorneys cross-examined both witnesses. They pressed Eugene on his financial ties to the estate. They pressed Garrett on the yacht's gift value, but they could not overcome the forensic evidence. 2 independent documents, both authenticated, both written in Richard Hargrove's hand, both pointing to the same conclusion: the will that currently governed the estate had been tampered with. The judge ruled from the bench the following afternoon. The notarized will was declared invalid on grounds of post-execution tampering. The yacht and its contents were ordered transferred to the Hargrove Maritime Heritage Foundation to be established within 90 days under court supervision. Margot Hargrove was referred to the Carteret County District Attorney's Office for investigation of estate fraud. Margot left the courtroom without looking at anyone. Her heels struck the marble floor at a slower pace than the one she had entered with, as though the air in the corridor had thickened around her. Garrett walked out the front doors into the midday sun. Sloane was standing on the courthouse steps, her bag over one shoulder, her face turned toward the harbor. They saw each other across a knot of local reporters and onlookers. Neither of them moved toward the other, but neither of them looked away. 3 weeks after the verdict, the Hargrove Maritime Heritage Foundation was formally incorporated under the supervision of the Carteret County Probate Court. The board of directors, assembled from a mix of local historians, maritime scholars, and community representatives, extended an invitation to Garrett Callaway to serve as the foundation's technical director, overseeing the long-term preservation of the yacht and the cataloging of the recovered maritime collection. He accepted on one condition: that he would continue to perform the restoration work himself, by hand, on the vessel he had designed. Eugene Voss was appointed honorary advisor to the foundation's board. His pension, previously administered through a Hargrove family trust that Margot controlled, was transferred to the foundation's operating fund and secured under a new fiduciary agreement. For the first time in 3 years, his retirement did not depend on the goodwill of someone he no longer trusted. The North Carolina State Bar completed its review of the ethics complaint against Sloane Perry in 6 weeks. The investigation confirmed that no romantic relationship had existed between Sloane and Garrett Callaway during the period of her representation. The complaint was dismissed. Her firm in Wilmington offered her immediate reinstatement. She accepted but requested a lateral transfer to the firm's newly created Maritime Heritage Practice. A department that had not existed before her case gave it a reason to. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, the yacht Second Wind sat in its slip at the Beaufort Marina, fully restored. The hull gleamed white against the dark green water. The teak decks were oiled and warm beneath the sun. The brass fittings, each one polished by Garrett's hand, caught the light and held it. Nolan sat cross-legged on the foredeck with a sketch pad balanced on his knees. He was drawing 3 figures: a tall man standing at a railing, a woman with her hair pulled back, and a boy between them. He did not show the drawing to anyone. Garrett stood at the bow, running his hands along the rigging lines where they met the forestay. His fingers moved through the work the way they always did, steady, unhurried, precise. He heard footsteps on the dock below and looked down. Sloane was walking along the pier, not toward the courthouse, not toward her car, not carrying a briefcase or a filing. She was just walking, the way a person walks when they have no appointment to keep and no document to deliver. She stopped at the edge of the gangway and looked up at him, 3 meters of air between them, the sound of halyards tapping against the aluminum mast, the smell of varnish and tidal salt. Neither of them spoke. Then Garrett reached down not to pull her aboard, but to hand her a cup of coffee he had just poured from the French press on the nav station. Sloane took it, stepped onto the deck, and stood beside him at the bow. They looked out across the harbor together, where the late afternoon light turned the water the color of old bronze and the marshes stretched south in an unbroken line toward the open sound. The yacht that Margot Hargrove had given away to humiliate a boat mechanic had become an $11 million maritime preservation center, and the place where a mechanic, a lawyer, and an 8-year-old boy found something none of them had been looking for. Not a fortune, not a verdict, but a place to come home to.